Dr. Harold received his PhD in biostatistics from the University of North Carolina. And since 2003, he has been the professor of biostatistics and at the Vanderbilt University School of Medicine. And he was the founding department chair since 2003 up to 2017. And he's a fellow of the American Statistical Association, and his specialties are development of accurate prognostic and diagnostic models, model validation, clinical trials, and so on. So let us welcome Dr. Harold. He will talk about the controversies in preventive modeling, machine learning, and validation.
Well, thanks very much for the introduction. I'm very glad to be here and honored by the invitation. I'm also deeply honored to be on the same program as Mitch Gale. That's a high honor. So in my talk, I'm going to touch on several things such as challenges of big data and a little bit about controversies in machine learning and controversies about model validation. Now, the setting for my talk is a little bit different from the setting of Mitch's talk in that I'm referring mainly to models that are derived very empirically from usually large databases. These are not models that are using a lot of subject matter expertise with very carefully, patiently specified models, but I'm referring to more empirical modeling largely. And so I'm going to launch right into one of the big dilemmas today in that setting, which is many journals are rejecting papers that have an internal validation that's really excellent because they did not include an external validation. So external validation is generally taken to mean a validation in another country or another time. That's a typical definition, but it's actually not that well defined what we really mean by external validation. And if you mean to validate, say, a risk prediction model for calibration and discrimination, in another time or place, wouldn't it be better to put time or place in the model? Because that way, then your model would apply to future patients if you have a time trend, and it would apply to the other locations or regions of the world if you actually model regional differences in the model. So to avoid surprises, you could remove the temptation to label time and place differences as a failure to validate, but instead just label them as time. There was a time trend in the data, secular trend, or there were just regional differences. So we can learn about regional differences and differences in health systems, and we can account for those somewhat in our modeling. And so we'll learn how to get predictions in other settings. Now, this is a very subtle point, but if your model is really pre-specified and thought through, such as the model that Mitch has worked on for many years, the external validations that you do in other populations actually does validate that model. In the more empirical setting where you're using empirical model selection, such as variable selection, if you think about it a little bit more, you're not actually validating a magical model, but you're validating only an example model, because when you do feature selection, you have tens of thousands of possible models, and you may force yourself to choose just one of those models, and you'll find a lot of the other models are just about identical in quality of predictions to the one that you chose. So you're actually validating an example model. So in many cases, especially in this empirical setting, that I'm referring to, is better to use resampling to validate the process that produced the model while being honest about the instability of model selection. Now, I'm kind of alarmed at what I see in the last 20 years in biomedical research, that people are doing a lot of model selection, but they're not really reporting on the stability of that. And I will be talking more about that later. This is a sort of a controversial way to think about things. Instead of validating models, we need to validate researchers, even more importantly. A lot of the failures that we've seen in biomarker-guided prognostic models and diagnostic models and other predictive models in general are really, really quite predictable by a statistician once you know the study design and the analysis design. The quality of the research and the analysis methodology highly influences the reliability and usefulness of the resulting research. So validating researchers or validating their analyses is something you can do very quickly. Some of you may remember a very big scandal that happened at Duke University in North Carolina about, maybe 12 to 15 years ago. I forgot exactly when, but it made a lot of it got a lot of media attention, a lot of investigative journalism reports, Wall Street Journal and Washington Post, and a lot of other reports. And this researcher, Pody, was developing lung cancer signatures that were supposed to be used for telling you which chemotherapy is most effective for treating exactly which kind of lung cancer. And there were design mistakes made throughout the research program and a lack of transparency, such that when people asked to see how they developed their predictions and their molecular signatures, the research team led by Pody would not provide the information. Now, one thing about the National Cancer Institute is when they're giving you funding to do the research, they have some say in the matter. And a very wonderful statistician at National Cancer Institute, Lisa McShane, asked very firmly to get the details about the method used at Duke University. And so she quickly ran the software provided by the Duke researchers, and she found that if she ran the code twice in one day, she would get much different answers. So she could not even replicate the results with the same data, the same code, running it in the morning and then running it in the afternoon. So that's a signal that there's a pretty serious problem. And that problem could have been averted by having the researchers work checked and their methods checked, their algorithms checked, and just allowing independent researchers to validate what they're doing. So an independent research team can check reproducibility and specificity of a statistical analysis plan and can conduct their own analyses to check the robustness of the results. Now, variable selection, or you could also call it feature selection, is one of the most troublesome things in the big data world. And it's troublesome whether you're using purely statistical methods or machine learning. And so there is this idea that we typically want things to be parsimonious without really understanding that in this empirical sort of modeling environment, parsimony is the enemy of predictive discrimination. So if you want to be very parsimonious, so you don't want to use too many genetic variants or protein expressions or whatever you're having in the model, the attempt to be parsimonious is going to cut into your predictive discrimination. And it requires spending information for making binary decisions. Is a feature going to be included in the model or is it going to be excluded? You can better use the information in the data for estimation instead of asking for all or none decisions, such as inclusion of a variable. It turns out that the probability of selecting the right variables is 0. So it's a hopeless task. Now, selecting the right variables is another way of saying you're naming names. So you might be doing a genome-wide association study with 2 million candidate genetic variants or SNPs, and to select from 2 million candidate features or variables to name 50 SNPs that are associated with some phenotype, that means you're naming the SNPs. You want to name them in a publication. The probability that you've named the right SNPs is 0. And a lot of that comes from the false negative rate. Researchers tend to worry too much, in my view, about the false discovery rate, and they don't worry enough about the false negative rate. In other words, what proportion of truly associated genetic variants are missed by the feature selection algorithm. So it turns out that the fraction of important features that are not selected is much greater than 0, and the fraction of unimportant features that are selected is much greater than 0. That's why you get a 0 up here. And so we're going to do something very simple that exposes the difficulty of the task in a low-dimensional setting. And if you have a difficult task in a low-dimensional setting, you know it's going to be more difficult in a high-dimensional setting with 2 million candidate variables. So let's take a situation where we have 300 patients and 12 predictors, and we have a continuous outcome. So we're predicting, say, a continuous phenotype or a continuous patient outcome. And let's say the outcome is measured with no error. So this is a very high signal to noise ratio situation. This is not like a binary lifetime breast cancer, yes or no. This is like predicting height or predicting blood pressure. So with 12 candidate predictors that are all uncorrelated with each other, there's no collinearity. That's actually a pretty large sample size with 12 candidate features. And we're going to simulate the data so the importance of the ith feature is equal to I. And we're going to have a residual standard deviation of 9, and we're going to rank the importance of these features. And there's lots of ways to rank them. You can rank them on a correlation coefficient, regression coefficient. I'm ranking this by partial chi-squared. It's essentially the same as ranking them on a squared correlation coefficient. And if you use the bootstrap technique to get a confidence interval for the rank of the importance of each of these 12 candidate features, you really expose the difficulty of the task. So the way the data were simulated, X1 should have been the least important variable because it truly has a regression coefficient of 1 in the population. And you see it came out as the second least important variable. The one that should have come out the most important is X12 because it has a regression coefficient of 12. But we actually found that it was the ninth weakest variable. And so we didn't get the variables correct. So the one that came out the strongest was the 9th, and it should have been the 12th. And the one that came out the weakest was the 3rd, and it should have been X1. But then the confidence intervals for the rank of importance of these variables is wide. And all these confidence intervals include the true rank in the population. So this confidence interval includes 1. This confidence interval up here includes 12. But the main thing to note here is just how wide the confidence intervals are. What are we able to say about the apparent winner? Well, the data are consistent with that variable X sub 9 being the 8th weakest, 9th weakest, up all the way to the strongest variable. So we've narrowed it down to a rank of 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. That's about as well as we can do with 300 observations. Just imagine what happens if you had 1,000 candidate proteins. Well, if you had 1,000 candidate proteins, this confidence interval would say that this variable that seems to be the strongest protein for predicting some medical outcome, the data are consistent with it being in the top 800 strongest proteins. So you think you've named a winner, but all you've been able to do is to select something that's in the top 800 out of 1,000 candidate proteins, for example, depending on the sample size. So this exposes how hard it is to say this variable is a winner, this variable is a loser, and we're going to drop it from consideration. The data are consistent with it being the 7th weakest. So that leads into this discussion, which is a commonly used statistical method called the Lasso, where we have 500 observations or patients. We have 500 candidate variables. The outcome is binary with a prevalence of 0.5. All of the X's are binary with a prevalence of 0.1, and we run 2,000 simulations. We select the lasso penalty using a commonly used method. But the way that we're getting the true effects of these 500 variables is we're sampling these from a Laplace distribution, which is exactly the prior distribution that Lasso is optimized for. So the Lasso assumes you have a large number of genes or proteins or whatever that have an effect that's very close to zero, and you have a small number with large effects. So we're actually giving the Lasso the best possible chance to work. And we're scaling it so the AU ROC is 0.8 in truth. So it's a medium discrimination case. And for each true regression coefficient, let's compute the fraction of 2,000 simulations in which that variable is selected by the Lasso. And you get this pretty disappointing graph. So when the real regression coefficient is very close to zero, you would like those variables to almost never be selected by the Lasso. But you can see that a lot of variables that had no importance are selected 25% of the time when you run 2,000 experiments and you replicate this. And we have a lot of features are selected more than 5% of the time. But these are features that should not have been selected, and they still have a reasonable probability of being selected. These are very strong features. These are strong negative coefficients. These are strong positive coefficients. Even the most strong variables that are truly strong in the population, they only have less than a 3/4 chance of being selected by the Lasso. So the success of selecting the right variables depends very strongly on how powerful the variables are in truth. And you want these probabilities of selection to be close to zero and close to one. So you want these to be close to one, you want these to be close to zero, and neither of those was in fact what happened. Again, the difficulty of the task and the false hope that we get by an empirical feature selection algorithm. So now let's turn to statistical models versus machine learning and just say a few things to put that into perspective. So statistical models such as Lasso, they involve using a probability distribution for the data. And statistical models have one thing almost always in common is they favor additivity. So we have additivity in the logistic model on the log odd scale. On the Cox model, it'll be a log hazard scale. Statistical models have identified parameters of interest. They are used for inference, estimation, and prediction. And statistical models tend to be more useful when compared to machine learning when uncertainty is high. Machine learning has had a number of successes when uncertainty is low, such as when you're doing image detection. So when you're looking at images and trying to recognize patterns in an image, machine learning can be an ideal technique for that, because when you look at what's happening, identifying things in images, that is a very high signal to noise ratio. If you're trying to identify who is going to develop breast cancer or ovarian cancer, that is actually a much, 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 much more difficult problem than recognizing whether an image is a cat or a dog. And so the image recognition is a much higher signal to noise ratio than cancer prediction. Machine learning tends to be algorithmic instead of algebraic. It gives equal opportunities for interactions as for main effects. It is used mainly for prediction and not for inference. And it's most useful when you have this situation I just mentioned. And then you have various kinds of machine learning. And it's interesting that there's a lot of public relations that goes into machine learning, where you hear deep learning used as a phrase. It's nothing more than a rebranding of neural networks. So deep learning is neural networks, although the algorithms have been tuned much better in the last several years. And a neural network is really not much different at all from polynomial regression, as Norm Matloff shows in a very nice paper. It's very interesting to me that once you get into an ultra high dimension, such as 2 million candidate SNPs in a genome-wide association, the machine learning methods break down and cannot be used anymore. Things like random forest, neural networks, and you can only analyze the data with a statistical model such as Lasso and other penalized regression models. And the reason that's true is it's not until you can assume additivity that you can have any hope of identifying parameters in a model. So any method that allows interactions when you have 2 million candidate features is going to be in trouble from the outset. Now, researchers generally undervalue the flexibility that's already available in statistical models and tend to think you need machine learning to get more flexibility. That's not always the case. There's more and more review articles coming out in the medical literature finding that the gains from machine learning are much more modest than what was reported 5 years ago. Now, the gains are in terms of predictive discrimination, but it's very important to note that when you look at calibration performance of machine learning, it's often extremely inferior, definitely more calibration problems than statistical models have. The majority of machine learning applications do not even assess calibration when they're interested in absolute risk. And that to me is a scandal in machine learning. This is amazing that this has happened. More than half of the machine learning publications do not even include a calibration curve when they're trying to show absolute accuracy. That's because a lot of machine learning methods were developed independent of statistics. Statistics has been doing prediction ever since regression was invented. Mitch probably knows what year it was. I think it was like in the 1920s or something. And so we've been dealing with prediction a long time, and a lot of that knowledge, that cumulative knowledge, was not taken advantage of in the machine learning world. Statistical models actually perform quite well in most situations and are definitely more interpretable. Now, when you start to think about the decisions you need to make, and there's a lot of ways to make good decisions. One of them is optimum Bayes decision. When you have a loss or utility function and you want to say minimize expected cost or maximize expected utility, to make the optimum decision needs absolute risk estimates. And that the absolute risk estimates go into the math that's needed to estimate the expected utility. So the expected utility uses the posterior distribution of the outcome probability for a single patient combined with the consequences of the wrong decision. So the reason I'm mentioning decision making here is that we need to put emphasis on statistical measures that we use to quantify the performance of models. We need to choose those measures that are consistent with optimum decisions. And so things like sensitivity and specificity and ROC curves and AUROC, those things are all related to how well a model can be used for decision making, but they're only indirectly related. So we need to use methods that put a little more emphasis on the actual absolute risk estimates. And in the Bayesian world, you would have a whole distribution for those that recognizes your model and coefficient uncertainty in estimating the absolute risks. So we have lots of ways of quantifying predictive information, but one of the themes I just want to emphasize here is emphasizing the absolute estimates from the model is probably the most important thing you can do. And it's also the most intuitive and useful. And so one thing you can do is just plot the distribution of your predicted risk. Mitch showed some graphs that were highly related to that. And you can plot differences in the absolute risk estimates. And those differences can be like if you use genetic information versus if you did not use genetic information. How do your risks change? So here's an example from some older data from the Duke Cardiovascular Disease Data Bank. where patients are referred for chest pain, and the outcome variable is presence or absence of significant coronary artery disease. And our basic model is going to be a model that has sex in it and age, and we're going to have an age by sex interaction, and we're going to allow age to be nonlinear by putting a spline expansion of age in the model. And then we're adding a new biomarker to the model. It was new many decades ago, not so much now, but just pretend that total cholesterol is a new biomarker. One of the things we need to take into account when we're assessing the value of a new biomarker is the biomarker may interact with other variables in the model, and that's the case here, which is also shown in the Framingham risk equations. The importance of cholesterol decreases with age. So this has been known from Framingham for a very long time. So you may need to have an interaction with the biomarker and other variables like age. And when you're assessing the yield of the new data, whether it's a biomarker or gene expressions or genetic variants, you need to remember that interactions may be needed. So here's what to me is one of the most intuitive ways to look at the importance of adding new information to a model. It's almost exactly analogous to one of Mitch's graphs where he showed density functions for risk distributions, and he showed a shift in these density functions. This is really just about the same thing. These are just histograms with lots of bins because we had a range of risk of coronary disease. Coronary disease is a lot easier to predict than lifetime breast cancer, I think. And so you have a wide distribution of risk, and then you see the distribution of the pretest variables. This is age and sex. This has a variance of 0.047. Mitch was talking about the variance on the log, I think it was the log risk scale. This is the absolute risk scale variance, but same idea. So you have this variance if you don't have cholesterol in the model, and you see how the predicted risks change when you add cholesterol to the model. Adding cholesterol means you're also adding age by cholesterol interactions into the model. You see the main difference is not so much here, but it's over here where you're able to give a lot more people very low risks of having coronary artery disease at the moment. So you're adding this hump, and that makes this variance go up to 0.057. So to me, this graph is your single best descriptive statistic for the added value of cholesterol or any set of variables that you're considering adding to a model. But you can go further than that because you could say, here is the model without the new marker. It's just got age and sex in it. Here is the post-test probability. So this is how does the pretest probability change once you know cholesterol? So you see it changes typically that much. It changes by about 0.25, 0.3. And this is the quantile interval. I forgot exactly which quantiles these were, but I think this is the 10th percentile to the 90th percentile. So you can see that this quantile interval gives you the typical distribution of the post-test probability. So if you knew somebody had a chance of disease of 0.5 without knowing the marker, now the probability is typically between 0.3 and 0.65. So we can see the yield of the new information there, and then we can see it in a more specific way here by plotting age on the x-axis, and this is the estimated post-test probability minus the pretest probability. And by virtue of the fact that cholesterol becomes less important as you get older, and you have the cholesterol by age interaction, you can see that the difference in the pretest and the post cholesterol risk predictions goes straight down. And once you get above age 75, the importance of knowing your cholesterol is virtually zero. And so just think about all of the indexes that we're used to seeing in the literature, such as classification accuracy, area under the receiver operating characteristic curve, NDI, NRI, a lot of different indexes. None of them, in my view, really capture something that this simple display captures, which is we can look at the yield of the information. What is the yield of knowing cholesterol to our risk prediction for coronary disease as a function of age? And we can see that it's a very strong function of age. So that concludes what I wanted to say, and I'm glad to entertain questions, see if there's any discussion, and I want to thank everyone for listening.
Thank you very much, Frank. And any questions from online? No? So I have maybe some general questions for Frank, and maybe Mitch can also give some comments. Because we're talking about the real world data, real world evidence nowadays. And then could you two and give some your comments on the research and also the applications when we do this kind of work? Maybe Frank, you first. Okay, I know you gave some points, but could you say here, because we still have maybe 5 minutes?
Yeah, I would love to start that and then hear what Mitch has to say. So the area of real world evidence and real world data is a very hot topic now because it's being used in drug development, and the regulatory agencies are having to deal with it and are mandated to deal with it. I've always been a fan of prospective cohort studies. And so if you give me a really nice prospective cohort study where you have a data dictionary where all of the variables are very well defined, the measurements are standardized. And I'll give you an example. I think one of the best that's available worldwide is the NHANES study from the National Center for Health Statistics, Centers for Disease Control in the US, where they have very standardized laboratory equipment. They bring a bus into neighborhoods and they do blood tests, and everything is standardized, beautiful data. And the point about having a prospective cohort is you know what the data mean, you know what time zero means, and you have quality control. The kind of real world data a lot of people are trying to use is data that comes from another purpose, such as administrative billing data and so on. And I've seen too many examples where somebody used a machine learning method, and it doesn't really matter whether it's a statistical model or machine learning, but they used a pretty aggressive data analysis on electronic health records, and they never defined in their paper what time zero was. And if they define time zero, some of the papers have an invalid time zero that has a kind of immortal time bias built into it. So if a paper cannot get time zero correct, like what is the start of surveillance? What is the start of observation? Is it when patients get disease? Is it when they're first treated for disease? What is it when they first come to your medical center? If you can't get time zero right from your real world data, I have a lot of worries. So Mitch, what do you say about all this? I think you're muted.
Well, I agree totally with Frank, that there's an important distinction between consortial studies of well-defined cohorts and more general excursion into administrative data and other sources of data that are gathered for various reasons. And these data may give, depending on the question being approached, they may give a useful background or useful sense of how important a problem is. But if you're really trying to, let's say, develop a risk model, or even more ambitiously, if you're trying to find out whether a certain drug is associated with a certain outcome, you have to consider the many potential weaknesses of data collected for a different purpose, including selection issues. How were the people or the subjects that are included in this database selected, and how representative are they of a population that you're interested in, including important missing data, measurement error problems, and as Frank was talking about, what is time zero? Just one other comment. Even, in epidemiology, we have the retrospective cohort study. That's a very simple study in principle. Suppose I want to go back to a factory and see, if I knew all the people that were working in the factory at a certain time, and could follow them all forward, and if I had good information at time zero that Frank was talking about, I would have a cohort study. But frequently, you only have exposure information on certain kinds of people that were working in the factory, potentially. Frequently, you've lost track of certain kinds of people. Frequently, trying to reconstruct what the exposure was at time zero is a very difficult thing. And so, even though in principle a retrospective cohort study might be able to give us a good answer, it's subject to a number of data measurement and data quality and loss to follow up, and time zero, you may only get good follow up on the people who are doing well, for example. That's an example. Well, there are all kinds of problems, even in that simple setting of the retrospective cohort study. So try to extend that to situations where the data are being collected for a variety of reasons. And I think some of the problems of the retrospective cohort study can be confounded. There's a nice paper by Pam Shaw, working with a colleague of Frank's, I think, showing that if you use electronic databases and you also conducted a special validation study to recapture some of the missing information or mismeasured information, you can sometimes improve on the inference from the administrative database by embedding a validation component in it. But in general, you have to be very careful about what is actually being gathered, what kind of data are actually being gathered, and what kind of questions you're really trying to answer.
Thank you very much.